Well, I'd like to begin today's Reading Russia with this editorial in Nezavisima Gazeta, which I find quite interesting. Now, I may be reading too much into this, and feel free to let me know what you think in the comments below, but I sense that there are two very different messages at play here. The editorial is entitled, "Why European Politicians Are Openly Talking About War." Recently, European politicians and the military have begun talking about a possible military conflict with Russia. Because of these concerns, Western countries have significantly increased defence expenditure. Now, on the one hand, the writer expresses what you might call the official Kremlin line, that Europe will not defeat Russia, that European society is not ready to embrace a war economy. It would be even harder, but necessary, to convince young Europeans who are accustomed to a normal and comfortable life to do military service and be ready for mobilisation. Most likely, such a fundamental change in approach in Europe would spark a reaction from Russia. But given the peculiarities of its socio-political and economic system, Russia would find it much easier to do this kind of thing than the EU. So here, the writer is on message. But there's also this thought. Europe is not ready for a military conflict and has not prepared mentally for one. Before 2022, in EU countries, there were no calls to go and fight. No one was calling on politicians to do that. In other words, there seems to be an admission here that it was Moscow's actions, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, which sparked Europe's concern, Europe's increased defence spending, and this fear in Europe of a war with Russia. And that pre-2022, the very idea of such a war never crossed people's minds in Europe. And that thought differs from what you hear from a lot of pro-Kremlin commentators and officials who tend to claim that the West has been plotting for years to destroy Russia. I wonder whether this thought is aimed at those running Russia, to encourage them to see that Europe is not inherently anti-Russian and that there are objective reasons why Europe believes a conflict with Russia is possible. Some of the messaging in the Russian press today is rather less subtle. Moskovsky Komsomolets suggests that in Ukraine, Russia's buffer zone could be extended right up to Kiev region. The photo shows Russian paratroopers on the edge of Kiev in 2022. This article describes the current pressure on President Zelensky as the start of an avalanche. Commenting on reports of a 28-point US-Russian plan to end the war, the writer adopts a mocking tone. Remember, they used to say nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. That's all in the past. Kommersant thinks that Washington is pushing Kiev into talks and concessions. The US administration is increasing the pressure on President Zelensky, hoping to convince him of the inevitability of concessions to Russia due to the danger of military defeat and the major political crisis in Kiev sparked by the growing corruption scandal. It appears that neither Ukraine nor Europe took part in putting together the 28-point peace plan. But the pressure on the Russian economy continues to grow. Nezavisima Gazeta's top story today, recession in the Russian economy is almost inevitable, analysts say. Without a change to the current monetary policy, there is practically no chance of avoiding a recession in Russia, according to the Center for Strategic Research. A transition to a fall in Russian GDP is now inevitable, analysts say. However, the reports of the central bank paint a totally different picture of a business climate in Russia that continues to improve and will soon get even better. The government, too, avoids describing the current realities. On Wednesday, Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak spoke about how the Russian economy had grown 2 years ago and how it will revive again by 2030.